Hello, and welcome to the podcast Envision, Accelerate, Excel. I'm your host, Karen Stanley, and in each episode, we seek to highlight a successful person who's willing to share the backstory of how they had a vision, accelerated their strategy, and brought their dream to fruition with excellence. That's Envision, Accelerate, Excel. I'm happy to say today we're doing something a little different because what happens if you're on one course and you're excelling, but then life happens and you need to re envision a new pathway? Well, that's why we have with us today Dr. Linda Rossetti. She is an author, an entrepreneur, a former Fortune 500 C suite executive, and she has an active coaching business for CEOs around the world. And yet, with all of that, she also cares very deeply about the college age population and is working to help them learn to re envision their situation and to be able to do what is the title of her book, Dancing with Disruption. Linda, thank you for joining us today. Now, full disclosure, Linda and I are classmates from Harvard Business School. And we actually didn't know each other in the 90s. So I really just want you to tell us a little bit about first the vision. Why did you even write the book, Dancing with Disruption?
Well, Karen, I appreciate you taking the time to ask that question because I think in life we always jump to the like, oh, here's the flashy endpoint, and it's not always elegant to get to that place. And so um, I was inspired to write the book because I was at a place where nothing was working. I was working at a very large job. In fact, I tell a very funny story in the book. One day, I stole a car inadvertently, right? I was rushing out of the office trying to get home. And when I got to the parking garage, which, by the way, we all left our keys in the car, um, the two cars that my household owned were right in front of me. And I hopped in the one that I always drove. It just so happened that I didn't drive it that day. I drove the other vehicle. And I didn't realize that I was in the wrong car till I was well outside of the building. So, I say that not to say, oh my goodness, this is how I operate. It's as an illustration to say I was at a point where I was really depleted and I was working at a large global company. I had two young children. There was just a lot happening and I wasn't functioning in a way that I recognized. And I wish I knew then what I knew now, what I know now, because I was in the throes of a transition. I had no vocabulary to describe what was happening for me. And when I turned to trusted others to ask them for advice, they just were kind of like, oh, you'll be fine. Just keep your head down or get a new job. You'll be fine. And and I think it was a combination of how frightened I was of where I was and the other people's reaction to what was happening to me that really inspired me to really take a moment and say, wait a minute, something's going, I can't be the only one that this is happening to. And that has led me to what has been now almost 12 years of curiosity about what happens when we as adults kind of experience something that causes who we know ourselves to be to get disrupted in some way. And it is those moments that I'm fascinated by, and I'm really interested in how we respond when we find ourselves in those places. Because one thing that I've learned is that it happens to all of us, right? It isn't to the few, right? All of us go through life, and we build these identities or understanding of who we are, and things happen, right? The company we work for gets acquired and we lose a job, or we get divorced, or someone's sick, or 1,001 things can happen. And it's in those moments, how we respond in those moments, that fascinate me. I just cannot turn away from it. And I think that we have an opportunity as a society to learn how to understand those moments in a better way and to respond using different skills. And with that combination of those two things, I've witnessed now over the last decade, it can really mean a beautiful inflection point in people's lives.
Well, I love what you're saying that we can learn how to dance with disruption. We can learn how to be good at being resilient, because it just seems like some people are better at it than others. But you have created a construct that can help anyone who is in a minor or a major disruption. And as I lead into one of my favorite chapters in your book, I just want to share with everybody, you often hear, well, so many things are beyond my control, but what can I control? And you turn inward, but sometimes that can turn to blame. But you, Linda, had a construct called the incubator, about turning inward on the things that we can work on. So could you tell us a little bit about the incubator?
Yeah, sure. The incubator is just a framework to try to help people understand the various activities that need to happen. I remember there was this one gentleman who was involved in my research, right? To get this all going, I sat with hundreds of individuals who were going through a wide variety of transitions. Many were career related, a career shock of some sort, loss of a job, or reallocation in the workplace, a reduction in hours, all those things. And so the incubator was really meant to put some structure around, well, how do I go forward when I don't know what's next? And I think it all starts with really understanding the disruption, right? I remember there was a woman who was in my research, and she was somebody who was super smart, right? She had gone to school and spent many years trying to become a physician's assistant,
Mm.
and she worked and worked and worked, and she was at the very end of what was a long cycle of studying to get licensed and be able to work as a physician's assistant. And she said, I had done all of that, and all of a sudden I got to the end, and she said, I realized it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And
Oh
she was
no.
devastated, right? She was devastated. And it's at those moments, right, that's of no fault of our own. We imagine something is going to be a certain way, and for whatever reason it doesn't work out, or again, someone gets sick, things change. And I think that, from working with her, it was really trying to say what goes on. And the first thing to understand is what's happening in that moment, right? Is it that just the PA program that young woman was in, maybe it was the wrong program. Maybe she needed to switch, to a different university or college or community college. Or maybe she needed to leave PA entirely. And so the first thing, Karen, that I really like to talk about is it a change or is it a transition? Right?
Mm.
Because that tells us what we do once we enter this incubator, right? And very often in life, things happen, and we don't perceive that we have choices. But when we go through transitions, we really do. And that's where the difference between change and transition comes in, right? So changes occur when there's something we need to respond to, but we can articulate the outcome, right? There's a known outcome, right? If I'm a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, all of a sudden maybe the butcher shop closes and I need to go find another job, right? I'm still a butcher and I'm going to go find a new place of employment, right? So changes are used to think about an alteration or a variation, but on a fixed self concept, right? I'm still the butcher. That's who I'm going to be. Transitions are very different. Transitions occur when there's a shift in what holds value or meaning to us. And they can occur when we're 22 or 82 or anywhere in between, right? It has nothing to do with age. Changes are used to do an alteration or a variation, but on a fixed self concept. Whereas transitions occur when there's a shift in what holds value and meaning to us. And what that requires us to do is really spend some time to think about that self-concept, this notion of who I've become, and think about what about that is shifting. And so those transitions can occur anytime in our lives. And the fascinating thing in my research is that the great majority of us are invited time and again to transition, but most of us don't. We defer to change at that point. And what
Ugh.
happens at that moment? What happens at that moment is we're leaving an enormous amount of untapped potential on the table, because transition is really the only way where we can access greater and greater portions of our capacity. And so, the first thing, that we want to talk about is, for that woman who was, in the physician assistant school and all of a sudden says, wait a minute, I'm not in the right place, that isn't a failure in any way. What that is kind of, you know, that person having an opportunity to say, hey, wait a minute, is this a change? Am I in a, am I just not in the right place? I need to make an alteration, but I'm still going to track on to physician's assistant. Or is it a transition, right? Is there something about how she's thinking about herself that for whatever reason has gotten disrupted? And that is a transition. And it is that path that I'm fascinated with, because that is the way that we get to access more and more of who we are. And the great majority of adults, in fact, 60% of adults, never actually make that choice to get at that higher amount of their capacity, which is a real
What was
heartbreak.
that number? That's astounding.
The majority of adults, 60%, never do.
Well, is that because we just don't like change? But the interesting thing with this vocabulary, most people don't love change, especially if it's a change that they did not initiate. But on the other hand, you're saying that people choose not to engage in a transition. And then is change in your vocabulary a retreat to try to be the old person when you have an opportunity for a new self concept?
It's such an interesting question you ask, Karen, right? Um, to answer your question, I want to just give a little bit more of thought about what this is, what these opportunities are in our lives, right? Very often when we enter adulthood, the way we kind of decide who we are is we draw tidbits from all these influences that are in our little personal ecosystem. So our influences from our families, the religious affiliations we have, the communities we live in, our education, the jobs we decide to do, right? So all of those things help us kind of piece together this concept of who I am. And over the course of our lives, we are repeatedly invited again and again, like my friend who was the physician assistant and was like, oh no, this is totally in the wrong place. We're invited to think about that identity that we created as kind of entering adulthood. And if we choose to move beyond that initial, right, that kind of socialize what comes from those around us, if we choose to go beyond that, what we do is we move to an identity that's informed, right? Its definition and its expectations are formed by what holds value and meaning to us, right? It moves to a much more self-authored state, right? So we go from like an externally defined, even though we're like putting bits and pieces together, we move to this very beautiful, externally informed, but we're leading with our own voices, right? So we move from an external to a self-authored. And very often in life, when we're faced with change, the emotions that are involved in all of that orient us backward, right? They orient us to stability. And so that keeps us in this loop of not changing. And so part of the work that, I'm so happy to be here today talking with you. Part of the work that I do is just educating people on this framework, right? Because once we know, all of a sudden, this notion of, well, I was going to be a physician assistant, now I'm not, it doesn't become so scary. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I might be growing. Because I'll tell you, when it happened to me all those years ago, Karen, we are fortunate, right? We have access to extraordinary people who can help us in ways we never even dream of. But I can tell you, as I was reaching out to all those people, trying to figure out what it was that was going on, that was causing me to like not function and steal cars, not one person said to me, this could be growth. And
Huh.
in fact, that is what the description I just made, right? Going from this kind of externally defined thinking of who we are to a self-authored thinking about who we are.
Mm.
It is what is adult growth. And I don't want your listeners to hear, oh, self-authored, I'm going to be like, oh, me, this is all about me. That's not it at all. What it is honoring is that we each have unique gifts. And instead of tamping those down to try to maybe fit into something we were told was the right path, we're giving some of those gifts oxygen as we move into self-authored. And so
Mhm.
this growth progression becomes this beautiful fusion of kind of where we began and how we thought about ourselves, and then making room for these unique gifts that we all possess to come forward in ways that can be beneficial to us and to all those people who are around us.
Fascinating, because now it sounds like you're a psychologist, Lyndon. I know you recently achieved your PhD, earned a PhD. Congratulations. Is this psychology?
You're so kind to ask that, and thank you for your kind words. I did. I just finished a doctorate because I cannot turn away from this topic, Karen. That's the honest truth. And this isn't psychology as much as it's a frame of study called human development. And it's
Oh,
informed by psychology and psychiatry, but it's also informed by biology and neuroscience, right? It's about how the brain reacts to stimulus and how our bodies react. And you asked me moments ago about this incubator, and I do want to say a couple of
mm-hmm.
words about that, right? Because
Yes.
when we go to these places where who we believe ourselves to be gets disrupted in some way, and we need to re-anchor that, right? We need to somehow get stability, right? Two things are required of us at that point, right? One thing that's required is really re-envisioning who we'd like to be, right? How can we call upon our skills and the things that interest us and engage us and allow us to be the person we want to be in our lives, right? How do we do that? How do we envision? But there's a parallel path to it that is all about navigating the intense emotional reaction to that change, right? So the incubator, which you asked about long ago, is really made up of activities to address these two things, which are the requirements to respond successfully in a transition, right? It is envisioning who it is we want to be and how to move forward when we are facing a blank slate because we don't know, and how do we deal with the emotional response to that? Because it is intense, because our whole neurobiological system, our emotive system, is designed to keep us safe. And when all of a sudden we read, our psyche reads instability, our emotive system kicks in and will orient us backward, right, to a place that our psyche believes is safe, when in fact that makes it even harder to move forward to try to re-envision what's next for us.
I love that you said that. I always use memory tools. So that was, these are key success factors that you're sharing with us now. E for envision, or in this case, we're speaking of re envisioning when you feel a disruption. And then N is for navigating the emotional response, because that's going to be a part of human nature. I heard you say neuroscience and biology. That's just our biological response, kind of like fight or flight. Is this related to that?
Karen, you're right on it, right? You're right. You know, Karen was a genius, and what a contributor she was, and continues to be for
Thank
our
you.
class, right? She really sets a beautiful model of leadership throughout our entire adult lives. So it's such an
Thank
honor to
you.
be here with you, Karen.
Thank you. You're too kind.
This notion, though, of emotional response is so important, right? And when we encounter anything, a traumatic experience, right, there's a sudden loss in our lives, we lose a job, or even when we something fantastic happens and we feel overwhelmed, right, all of these emotions happen in our lives, um, very often because our emotive system is like the perfect generative AI system, right? It knows every experience we've ever had in our lives. And when we get to this period of instability, it knows that for Karen, it's going to be overachieving. That's the thing we're going to throw for Karen. And for Linda, it's going to be sadness or whatever it is, right? I'm just using these as examples.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, what we can do is we can learn techniques to help us recognize those emotions, have those emotions, but don't give them power over us. And that is the key to navigating transitions successfully, right? I often say, sadness is emotion that I carry a lot, right? It has to do with my life. But I often say before I learned how to kind of navigate emotions in transition, what would happen, it was as if I was holding onto the end of a rope that was sadness. And depending on the day, sadness could whip me around willy-nilly. But
I'm
with
sorry.
so good with techniques, right? It's as if that rope, I can drop it on the floor next to me, right? I can see it, right? It's still here, but its power over me is completely diffused. And so
Wow.
that's one of the techniques that I teach in the book, and we can talk about it here if it's interesting, right? It is a complete reframing technique, right? It asks us to recognize the emotions we're having, but also
Mm-hmm.
ask ourselves about the influence, right? Because when we externalize, right, in asking questions, like it's almost like the Six Sigma, our business school training of emotions. It's, when we slow down and we use questions to help us experience the emotion instead of just a reflexive automatic, here we go, this is my, overdrive behavior, it's a Tuesday and I'm on it. When we slow down, um, it's amazing how those emotions can then be turned into signals or power for us to be able to actually learn from and navigate the transitions that much better.
Well, that is a word that I have heard in some books I have read on stress management, reframing. When
Mhm.
you try to remove yourself from the emotion and you look at the situation, you reframe it. For example, I had an opportunity. Now I can look back on it and say it was an opportunity, but it actually was a very traumatic time in my life. Our bookkeeper of 38 years at Stanley Construction retired. And if you think you know something, you know the daily routine, weekly, monthly, annual routine of a person who has been there 38 years, let them leave and you will find out you don't know as much as you think you know. And so I felt like after she left and I had to almost relearn her job in order to teach it to her successor and to train the succeeding bookkeeper, I felt demoted. I felt terrible when I was sitting in there just literally cutting the checks myself. And then I had to reframe it and say, no, and I literally was telling myself several nights, just feeling dejected and missing vacations. Okay, I have to reframe this, Karen. It's a reality. It's here. I have to move through it. What else could this be beside me being demoted to bookkeeper myself? And then I started to think of myself as a consultant and as a trainer. I said, well, if I'm going to teach someone else, I have to learn it myself. So this is just a transition for me to learn how to learn enough to be a trainer. So is that a good example of reframing?
It's a beautiful one. Thank you for sharing that, right? And
It's true.
reframing is the technique that I use with the work you referenced earlier in the call that I do with college age students, right? We
Mm,
teach them a reframing technique, which is in my book, which is called HAIL, HAIL. And
mm,
each of the letters of HAIL, the H, the A, and the I, and the L, stands for a question that we teach people to ask themselves to help them basically shift their perspective on a situation, right? And so you know, one of the students that we were just working with had lost a parent very sadly, and was thinking that he really didn't belong in school anymore, and he was
mm,
just overwhelmed by emotions and really had a hard time, going to class and doing what all the things that we would expect a student to do. And Hale asks him to honor or name the emotions that are a part of his experience of loss and wondering if he doesn't belong in school anymore.
mm,
Ask ask the A asks somebody to think about the emotions that they're having and the kind of meaning they have in their lives. The I is influence, right? How is it influencing? And that young man was, not going to class. And L is learn, and learning asks to think about the insights you get from asking these questions. And it's as if, Karen, you and I right now, we had to draw your studio, and we, very, conscientiously sat there and drew it. And then I said, okay, Karen, now let's go outside the studio and draw that
mm-hmm.
same studio, but stand in the doorway. And we would see it from a different perspective. And that's really what reframing is all about. It's really trying to give people a set of questions that allow them to take something that may be fixed and driving an automatic set of reactions, like your bookkeeper exiting the business and you feeling crummy about having to sit there, and really shifting your reaction to it. And that is, enormously freeing. And we teach it again and again to students and adults. And yeah, I can't say enough about it. I can tell a story too. I don't know if that's helpful, but you tell me how you want to use the time.
Well, it is, but I know we have about three more phases in the incubator. And also, I just want to applaud you on really articulating how to reframe, because for some, they say just positive thinking, just it
Right.
can't be as bad as you think. And this is not just positive thinking.
And so thank you for mentioning that, because the positive thinking is the thing that I think makes me want to kind of explode sometimes, right? What Hale is doing is it's asking us to honor the emotions we have. There's no judgment on it. We're not saying, okay, oh, Linda's sad. Oh, we're not, oh, Linda, that's a terrible thing. No, we're not saying that. It's like, okay, I have sadness. I carry it a lot. No judgment on that. Positive thinking very often asks us to do an emotional bypass, which is, oh, if you get up and you feel sad, no, 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 don't feel that way. Feel positive. Like it asks us to maybe not trust our instincts and overwrite that emotion, right? Do an emotional bypass. If I get up and I feel um, sad or depressed or anxious, oh, don't feel anxious, be kind, right? There's so many messages we get in our society about the correct emotions we're supposed to have. And all of the reframing work that I've done, which is all research based, right, over the last 12 years, has told me in no uncertain terms that emotional bypass gets us in a bad spot, right? What it does is it teaches us not to trust our own instincts. And by the way, our instincts are awesome, because our instincts are hardwired signals to help us respond appropriately in thousands of situations. The last thing we want to do is teach ourselves to bypass that, right? We want that. And so the work that I do on reframing is really saying, look, let's honor the fact that we all have emotions, and having an emotion in and of itself is really all it is a signal. It's meaningless. It doesn't hold meaning itself. How we respond to it really has some implications. And so that's why Hale really talks about honoring the emotion. Say it out loud. It's good. It's okay. There's no judgment of having that emotion. Think about
Mm.
what meaning that emotion has in your experience, right? For me, sadness is about, it comes way from when I was a kid, and sometimes of being alone. It made me very sad, right? Influence is, it asks us how it influences my behavior today. When I'm sad, before I learned all this stuff, I would go inward, right? I would really draw inward, when in fact I'm somebody who gets my energy from people. So going inward was like a total downward, like a downward spiral for me, right? But right, HAIL is learn. And learn says, okay, well, wait a minute. We just put some things together about an experience of emotion. What new insights or thinking might you now ask about that emotion? Might it be inviting you to think differently, or recognize that it's time to move beyond that reaction, right? That automatic stuff, maybe it's beyond. But I digress, and it's really off this notion of, bypassing emotions, which unfortunately many people get that message in society,
Mhm.
is really a wrong turn. And we want to honor our emotions and use them as the font of knowledge that they really are, and then help us get at these tremendous gifts we all have. And so many of our gifts are underdeveloped or under accessed. And that's the part, Karen, that makes me absolutely crazy and gives me forever energy for this work, because I believe the cure for cancer is out there, right? If we just teach people to not feel as if they're somehow wrong or broken, um, everyone has something to give.
Well, I pray the cure for cancer is out there. Certainly, certainly, certainly. Now, from reframing, you have another set of maybe tools, resetting expectations. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So, very often when I sit with people who are going through a transition, they're like, okay, I used to be a physician's assistant, but now I'm not, and I don't know what to do, right? Like, what's next is like blank slate. Or, there was one woman in my research who had struggled with sobriety. And she looked at me and said, I don't know who I am without alcohol, right? All sorts of things come up to this moment where we don't know how to move forward. And very often in our minds, we instantly think, like, I have to have a destination. Like, if I'm not going to be a physician's assistant, then what? What am I going to be? And again, my research really led to some very interesting places on this, right? One was it really isn't about a destination and knowing the answer. In transition, the best things to do is are really to think about what assumptions or expectations we're carrying for ourselves and whether or not they're current. And ultimately, the first and most powerful step is to really list out the expectations we carry and then think about which ones have outlived their useful life. And
That's
it's
a powerful statement. Outlived their useful life, which is not to say they were wrong at the time. It's kind of like what the senators say. I voted the way I voted based on the information I had at the time. And
absolutely.
if that happened today, I wouldn't do it, but I'm not going to say that I regret doing it when I did it because there were reasons. So, can you say that one more time? Because I don't know that some people, especially when they're so attached to their own persona, can realize that expectations can outlive their useful time.
Useful
Did I say it right?
expectations can outlive their useful life, right?
Their
So
useful. Uh huh.
outlive their useful life. And so you sit down and you say, okay, well, the easiest way to do this is to do I am statements, right? I am a
Mm,
professional, I am a teacher, I am a bookkeeper, I am a whatever. And then really, think about what makes us think that's a good thing or not and write that down. And that's where we start to get about expectations. It's like, well, I remember one beautiful young woman, she said, my dad, always wanted me to be an engineer. Okay.
uh-huh.
And she said, I did everything I could. I went, I worked hard. I went to a great school. I got an engineering degree. I worked as an engineer. And she's like, then I kind of realized that, it probably wasn't the thing that was using my talents. And so, this notion of I am an engineer, I am a parent, I am a spouse, I am a friend, I am a daughter, I am a community member, I'm a religious person, whatever it is. And really think about those things and then go back and say, which ones of these have outlived their useful life? And that is the first step in really moving forward when we're in a transition. And yeah, and then I do have another piece, but let me pause there, Karen. Did that make
Well,
sense?
it
Isn't it?
sounds so freeing. For today's podcast, I'm going to have to name it Re-envision, Incubate, and
Re-
Reimagine,
reframe too.
because
Yes.
your next step is reimagining identity. And for a lot of people, that's very difficult because they're plugged into who they have been all of their lives.
And so this step is one of my most exciting steps. I love this. I love all of the steps, but this one is the most fun. And in order to really kind of reimagine, right, I ask people to write out their narratives, right? To say, let's imagine today if, Karen, you introduced yourself to me for the first time and actually write it out longhand or use a device, whatever you want, maybe even audio tape it. And oftentimes people don't struggle with that, right? In an instant, they say, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of times that is past focused, right?
Mm,
And then I say, okay, choose one value that hold dear, right? I'm centered on my family. I love the environment. Whatever it is, like there's no judgment on the value, just something that you hold dear. And
mhm.
then I say, okay, now rewrite your narrative, but write it with that centered, right? So for me, right, um, helping people be seen is like my value, like that is it, right? And so if I did my first narrative introduction, I'd say, oh, hi, I'm Linda Rossetti. I'm, a lifelong business person. I've been a CEO, I've been an executive, I've written several books, and now I spend my time supporting people in transition, particularly young, college students and young youth. Right. So that's my pre-narrative. But if I did it before, I would say if I did it with the value, I'd say, and my value again is helping people be seen. I would say, hi, I'm Linda Rossetti. The thing I really, really love is this notion of being seen, so much so that I've spent the last decade researching and getting an advanced degree to understand the tools necessary to help people be seen in this world. And if I think about it for a minute, it was a part of every one of my jobs, going back to
Oh,
my service in corporate America, as well as my service as a leader, a CEO of a tech company, and every role that preceded it. Right. So you see those two narratives are vastly different, right? One is very chronological, kind of past focused. The other is centered on a value. And it is that exercise that I recommend is the best for forward looking, Karen, right? Because it begins
wow.
to help us articulate those things that really engage us and help us begin to kind of create new linkages around the things we've done and the assets we have in our toolkit that we can bring forward. And it works like a charm. It's a wonderful exercise. I tell people to do it again and again. And the people that are really struggling, I have them do it every single day for a week, like 7 times, boom, 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 every day. And it is amazing the amount of progress people can make as they really get into, okay, what is a value and how could I anchor my narrative, my introduction around that value, that thing that is so important to me. And it is
Hmm.
that exercise that gives insights into what's ahead.
Talking about what's ahead, that was a topic that was a very popular topic at our reunion, at our class reunion. It was, what's next? What's the next chapter after, the successful business career? But often people struggle and they feel stuck there because they can't really reimagine their identity. But I think what I hear you saying is that you can be the same person, you're holding the same values, but you can operate in a very different fashion, perhaps from the past, but you have to keep the past, and then open your mind to the future. Where's the opening? Because I can say I am, but what does that mean I'm going to be?
Well, and Karen, it's a great question, and I think you're on to the point here that is so exciting, right? That at any moment where we have an opportunity to move forward, we have all these experiences, right? We have hundreds of experiences. Some of them are workplace derived, family derived, community derived, all sorts of things. And as we move forward, really, it isn't really taking a fixed set of things and putting it forward. What transition is inviting us to do is to take those things and and reorder them. It's called recentering. Recenter those things that really mean the most things to you. So instead of a fixed forward movement, we're saying, wow, all those assets, I could arrange them this way or that way. So as I recenter, I'm actually leveraging or building upon those things, those experiences that are so much yours, but expressing them in a new way. And that is really what happens in adult growth, is that we're constantly invited to re-architect those things that are unique to us, but center them in a way that works for the opportunities in front of us. And that's really what it's all about. And frankly, you reference the people in our classes, right? Our alumni group.
Right?
Very often people get to retirement age, right? Even though you and I are not of retirement age, right? We'll may never
No,
retire, right? I don't believe
never.
those milestones, right? But very often people respond with change, which
Uh-huh.
is which is I have a fixed self concept and I'm going to make an alteration or a variation. Transitions are about reimagining the assumptions upon which we set our definition and expectation for who we are. Right. So one
Well,
is
here's
fixed.
an example for you. Then help me with this, because I have heard some classmates say, all right, I'm not going to be a CEO of a business, but I think I'll still be a CEO of a not for profit. That's kind of a pretty typical move. And it sounds like what you're defining as the change from the fixed past over to a, very, what do I want to say, a non threatening or just comfortable, contextual future. So help me with that idea. And I guess there's no wrong way to handle it. But what would you say to the person that very quickly and automatically says, and when I'm done being a CEO here, I'm going to be a CEO over there?
I'd say hooray that you have clarity. Good for you. But I would say, are you sure you're not leaving something on the table? Right.
Mm,
but it's a fixed self-concept. And there's nothing wrong with that. The great majority of people navigate life that way. They make changes. And many think that kind of a change is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
But what transition says is that, that ability to tap into untapped potential will remain out of reach for those people, right? That there are still ways that you can impact the world and bring forward your gifts if you're willing to recenter your definition and expectation for who you are. And those people, even though they may perceive them making a contribution which fits their goal, they will be making a change, and they will miss the opportunity to transition, which is a growth opportunity. And so I won't ever judge. Everyone has to make a decision for themselves, but it's as if they're going, they're kind of treading water. And to me, uh, you know there's so much potential that they're leaving on the table. And in business school, we were always taught to exploit those opportunities, so it feels out of kilter for me, but many do that. And so I want your listeners to know that there's no judgment in this, but
Exactly. Thank
but
you
there
for
are
that.
but there,
No
right, there is
judgment.
no judgment. And change is a difficult and very respectable path, but so isn't transition. And where I think I get concerned is that when people default to change or no change, right, just status quo, because they don't know that this forward path is universal and available to everyone, right? Very often people get to this disruption in their self-concept and think for whatever reason they've failed, that something has gone wrong, they've made an error. And that couldn't be more incorrect. What that is that is an indicator you're being invited to grow. That isn't
Mm.
failure, that's benefit, that's beneficial. And so I have no judgment on anyone choosing change. Go for it. That sounds lovely. If you have the ability to pivot from being a CEO of a large organization and then going to a nonprofit, hooray, lucky that nonprofit to have your leadership and expertise. But I really, really fear more the people who face a blank slate on what to do going forward and believe they have somehow not done the right thing or made the right choice, or they're backed into a corner that they can't get out of, because that is a false notion. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really the folks that I want to make sure hear the message that there is enormous opportunity ahead, regardless of your age. Transition has nothing to do with age. You can be 22 and transition, or 82 and transition, or you can be both of those ages and never choose to transition, because transition is always a choice. You can be forced to change, right? That fancy CEO might get fired from the Fortune 500 company and have to go to the nonprofit, but you will never be forced to transition, right? That is always a choice. and
Mm-hmm.
and in my book, if people do have the opportunity, by the way, the book is available at most public libraries. And most of those public libraries also have the audio version of the book. Every single person I've interacted with who has chosen transition describes it as enlivening, freeing, optimistic. It's in positive words, right? It leads to an inflection point that most people never thought was possible in their lives.
So now I'm going to rename this podcast Re-envision, Incubate, and Grow. So, do you have any parting words? Let's say there is a young person out there who's listening, who's maybe in the junior year of college and wondering, is this the right major for me, or am I at the right school? What would you share with them to encourage them to explore the transition?
Uh, First of all, I think I would encourage them or invite them to ask questions, right? Ask questions of themselves and be okay with the answer that says, I don't know. And to continue to that openness, to be essential. And I also would suggest that in the experience of emotions that can quickly follow that answer of I don't know, recognize that the emotions are simply that, emotions. They don't mean that you've done something right, wrong, or indifferent. It really isn't. And that the ability to reframe or recognize that those emotions may just simply be trying to hold you in place instead of supporting your forward advancement. that it's worth thinking about. So those would be the two things. And I have to pause and recognize you, Karen, for the excellent contributions you're making to this community, and to all the communities you touch, because you're a fantastic leader. You're a wonderful, wonderful learner. And I hope that we can all get even a teeny bit close to the standard you set.
Well, thank you. That's the excellence. And I'm Karen Stanley, your host of Envision, Accelerate, Excel, and thanking you, Dr. Linda Rossetti, my dear classmate, for joining us today. I know that everyone who is tuned in to this podcast will enjoy, I dare say, even listen again to catch additional nuggets on how to reframe emotions, reset expectations, reimagine identity, and then go ahead and get that book, Dancing with Disruption, so you can find out about the fourth part of the framework, which we didn't touch on, but it's got to be important: reconstituting connections. And Linda, haven't we had so much fun connecting today?
You're the best, Karen. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.